Good afternoon, Eastern Washington and fellow Patriots. This is Matt Shea, and welcome to a very special Patriot Radio today. Not only are we going to be discussing a nationally breaking news story, but also it's the 500th episode of Patriot Radio on Podbean. Just so happens everything kind of aligned today. So thank you, first of all, to everybody that has been watching Patriot Radio, everybody that has been supporting us for all of these years and getting the message out. Today, you are going to want to get your finger on your mouse and hit the like button and the share button, because this is about to go viral. I want to also just welcome people outside of the Eastern Washington, North Idaho, Western Montana region, watching as far away as New Zealand, listening as far away as Europe. We couldn't have done this without you. And in fact, in several ways, we have been able to change the course of history together for good. Now remember, this is brought to you by On Fire Ministries and the legacy of Dr. Stan Monteith, bringing you the story behind the story and the news behind the news. It's not about right or left. It's about right and wrong, about our hope not being in man, but in Jesus Christ, about not ending in prayer, but moving to action. It's also about the gospel of the kingdom, Zechariah 2:5, but I, declares the Lord, will be a wall of fire to her on all sides, and I will be the glory in her midst. I want to take a moment right now, because this entire show is going to be dedicated to good versus evil. And I want to describe something that happened during the former Soviet Union. In the former Soviet Union, they would always accuse the Christians of being the bad guys, being the terrorists, being the reason that society was not as perfect as it could be under communism, when in fact they were the problem, the communists, all the way along. And today, on Patriot Radio, we are about to expose government corruption at the highest levels. And not only that, it will exonerate today many patriots who have been falsely accused, defamed, and smeared, including right here in Washington State. This is all part of a process when good Christians stand up. And you heard me right, good Christians stand up, not Christians sitting back on the couch. Good Christians stand up and speak the truth and expose evil. It can't help but transform the world for the better. And I hope this encourages all of you today, wherever you're at, in the local area or at the state level, wherever you have been placed by God, that you can take that sphere of influence and turn this country back toward Jesus Christ, the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, and turn it back toward good and drive out the evil. All of us have an opportunity, even at the local level, to expose corruption and to expose the forces, both Democrat and so-called Republican, and make them accountable, hold them accountable. Unelect them from office, but also hold them accountable in the court of law, at the ballot box, and even in the media, the right media, so that these evil things never return. These evil ways never return. These corruptions never return. Now, today, what I'm about to tell you is a little bit of a testimony, as well as it is a news story. We are in a time when information is used as a weapon. And that eventually, though, we can trust that the truth will come out, and that God is a righteous judge, and his justice does not wait forever. We are in a place as well where evil is being exposed on a constant and a daily basis. Ultimately, where we can have the best effect is in our locality, in our state, and in our region. And for those of you that keep track of spiritual things, and you've listened to Patriot Radio for years, this is going to be a very interesting thing. Tammuz 17, the Jewish calendar, this day is the day, and this was not planned, to have the 500th episode on Podbean on the same day as this occurred. I happened to get this stuff yesterday afternoon after the sun went down. So Tammuz 17 is the day that Moses came down from the mountain and exposed the golden calf worship. Today is the day that Joshua and Caleb exposed the false report, the bad report that had come from the other spies that had gone into the land, the promised land. And God honored that. And by the way, it exposed corruption inside of that nation that had to be dealt with for 40 years. Let us do the right thing today and take what is about to be exposed and do the right thing for this generation now and not wait for the next one. I also want to give you a refresher that Anatoly Golitsyn, one of the most important defectors from the former Soviet Union, Anatoly Golitsyn wrote a couple of books, but the most important, I think, is New Lies for Old. And in that book, as a strategic planner for the KGB, he details what is about to happen with misinformation and disinformation and how the government would turn seemingly good people into the bad guys, and how it was shocking to the people that it happened to because they didn't see it coming. Well, we have seen it coming, and it is truth that is going to win the day. It is Jesus Christ who is the solution. And so when you hear these lies being spouted in the news media and other places, you can always be the solution, which is the person who speaks the truth, unashamed and boldly to power. Because the truth always wins. And in fact, the Shea family motto is Vincit Veritas, or truth conquers. So today, truth is going and is conquering. We do walk in victory as Christians. And so I want you to take a moment, if you're online watching us, like, comment, follow, share the post. Take a moment right now and go to Rumble, the Patriot Radio channel there, and subscribe on Rumble. It's really important because this is how they try to shut us down, is by censorship. And believe me, they're not going to like what's about to come out. And lastly, to our fellow patriots here in this part of the United States, Frank is free, the Badger is hunting, 795-742. And that brings us now to our very special guest today, Sherry Duvally, senior editor of the Readout News and Readout Report. She has been a fearless warrior for the truth over the years. Sherry, it is great to have you back on Patriot Radio, especially for this momentous episode. How are you doing, my friend?
Oh, this is, I'm on cloud nine. I am so excited about what we're about to share with everybody.
Well, so am I. So several years ago, we had broke a story about a memorandum by Larry Wooten. It was a whistleblower memorandum about rampant corruption, misconduct, and outrageous behavior inside not only the Bureau of Land Management, but even beyond that. Well, today, and in fact, yesterday, we've been waiting for years for this to happen. Finally, we have access to Larry Wooten memo number 2, which is the details of the federal government warring, and there is no other way really to put it, against the people of the United States of America, but particularly people like the Bundys and also Todd Engel and Joseph O'Shaughnessy. We have been kind of waiting for this day. I've been waiting for this day because we knew the information was there. It was a matter of it working its way through the court system. And so I want to give a little bit of a historical background right now. There is a civil lawsuit that was filed, and Todd Engel is moving forward with that. And as a result of these suits that have been going forward, and in this particular one, I'll have Sherry tell you what that's about here in a second briefly. As a result of these suits going forward, these previously hidden documents are now coming to light. And so this Wooten II memo effectively exonerates the Patriot community. It destroys the narrative of the left regarding domestic terrorism. It very clearly highlights why the FBI should be completely disbanded and reconstituted as a constitutional law enforcement agency. And it also shows how the Rampart report is completely debunked. So let's get to it. Sherry, can you tell a little bit about Todd Engel's case, just so people understand what's going on, and then we're going to dive right into some of these rulings here and go through it page by page.
I'll try and give a short synopsis here. Todd Engel is from North Idaho. He saw the dreadful actions of our federal government against regular people. He saw the videos on YouTube, and he traveled down to southern Nevada to stand with them and was arrested for it and was actually incarcerated for 4.5 years. And there was actually no investigation on any Idaho defendants. This was kind of a game for them, okay? And this document proves that it was a real game for these special agents. One particular special agent did everything down to writing up what he called a kill list, where he bragged about forcing people to commit suicide in other cases. And he wanted to add to this kill list. This was a tremendous breach and show of corruption between the BLM and the FBI. They made a mockery of our federal government. They were told that I've got 100 pages from Wooten II. There's a ton of information in here, and it just verifies every single thing that we've talked about. They were told not to make arrests. They did not want the BLM and the FBI to do a giant show of force like that, but this particular special agent and his henchmen decided they wanted a big show of force, and so that's what they did. It had nothing to do with what was right or wrong. It had to do with them, their ego, and their corruption.
So let's go through this, starting first with the January 8th, 2018 court ruling, which I don't think anybody out there has heard until now. Specifically, the judge ruled the fact that, and this is, you can read this stuff, this is going to go up online, the fact that the prosecution failed to look through the files provided by the FBI is not mere negligence. It is a reckless disregard for its constitutional obligations to learn and seek out favorable evidence. The prosecution's reliance on the FBI to provide the required information amounted to an intentional abdication of its responsibility. And then it lists the different things that happened. Number one, that there was a camera set up to intentionally spy on the Bundys, but they characterize it as unintentional surveillance. In other words, it unintentionally got the house. The judge completely dismisses that and then says this, but the prosecution's decision not to follow up was not mere negligence. The government's proffer that views from a surveillance camera were never viewed by anyone nor recorded or reported in some format was simply inconceivable. That the prosecution accepted this implausible claim, whether it was provided by the FBI, is just another example of its reckless disregard to fulfill its constitutional duties to learn about evidence favorable to the defense that may have existed as a result of someone's notes and observations of the surveillance camera's live feed of the Bundy Ranch. Now, I want you to hear this next part. This is incredible. Listen to this. The court seriously questions why the FBI inexplicably placed or perhaps hid potentially exculpatory electronic information about the placement of FBI snipers. I remember we talked about this, Sherry, years ago, and they kept saying there were no snipers there, there were no snipers there. And then it comes out that, in fact, there were FBI snipers there on the ground. We'll get to that here in a second. Then it says this. in an unconventional location on a thumb drive inside a vehicle for over 3 years. Compounding the court's concern is that the FBI had almost 4 full years to prepare for trial and 2 years to disclose the information to the prosecution, and that their agents were physically present during the last 2 trials where the existence of snipers was contentiously debated. And so what the court is saying here is this was not by mistake. This was intentional. Sherry, your initial reaction to that before we move to the next part.
This shows very intentional behavior, not only by the BLM and the FBI, but also by the U.S. Prosecutor's Office. And there is the rub. Okay. This document is verifying that the U.S. prosecutor was well aware of certain things that were happening that were illegal, possibly felonies. And I'm not a lawyer, and I don't play one on TV. So I can only guess that somebody better follow up on this, because it's very serious stuff.
Yeah, this demands a congressional investigation, and I think this is the straw that breaks the camel's back. And the FBI, not only does their new gigantic facility need to be completely scrapped, the FBI needs to be scrapped as an agency. Let's go to the next one. This is Exhibit A. This is a motion that was filed by the attorneys for Joseph O'Shaughnessy and Todd Engel. And this is fascinating because this brings up a whole bunch of issues now that question the actual legality of the original operation to begin with. And now I want to just step back for a second. If the operation to impound cattle at the Bundy Ranch was illegal, then it cannot be, on the part of the Bundys, any sort of domestic terrorism. In fact, if they were operating illegally, it would be arguably domestic terrorism by the government. This is a huge thing. So this motion was made, and this is an interesting point that the attorneys for Engel and O'Shaughnessy make. As detailed more specifically below, operative language from those orders was omitted from the superseding indictment. Okay, so in other words, it was left out, and this is what was left out. That to seize and remove to impound any of Bundy's cattle was expressly conditioned upon the United States first providing notice to Bundy under the governing regulations of the United States Department of the Interior. Then it says this: it has to be written notice of intent to impound sent via certified mail or personally delivered to the owner or agent. And they're alleging that this didn't occur in this case, and there is no record that this occurred, even in the trial transcripts and everything else. So it seems highly unlikely the government's going to suddenly come up with that. And so if that's the case, Sherry, if the notice wasn't given, this entire operation, as they're arguing, as a matter of law, would be illegal. The whole thing. What's your reaction?
My reaction, there was no court order. They did this on their own. Nobody has been able to provide any court order. We've been asking for years, and nobody's been able to provide any court order. In addition to that, part of the background and history that Larry Wooten completed shows that their motto at the BLM Southern Nevada District Office was no moo in 92 and, quote, cattle free Clark County, cattle free in 93, pardon me. They also show that Gold Butte was likely part of the Arizona Territory when the Nevada Constitution was adopted, and Clark County, Nevada actually controlled the specific BLM grazing allotments at the time, and Cliven Bundy sent a check. He was sending checks to Clark County to pay his grazing fees. And their narrative was that he was a freeloader and on and on and on and on and never paid his fees. But it shows right here that Larry Wooten did the historical documentation to show that he did do it. He did pay his grazing fees to the ones that were in charge, which was Clark County.
Now, here is the next interesting point that's being argued. Also, the United States was required to obtain a brand inspection clearance certificate from the state of Nevada's Department of Agriculture. And so what's being argued is that this brand inspection also never happened, which again, any movement of that cattle without that brand inspection, what they're arguing is would be illegal. So this is another point in this where this operation, again, may be illegal. Go ahead. What's your reaction?
Well, they talked to the brand inspectors. It's right here in Wooten II. They talked to them, and the brand inspectors did not want this big public to do. They said, no, if anything, we might be able to cite him for an infraction, but that's all. And they said this is not the narrative that they want to see in the public. They were very determined. They would not listen to the brand inspectors because they had a different agenda.
So then the last one on this page that we're going to talk about in this document specifically, and this is where it gets very interesting, okay? Because the withholding of exculpatory evidence or evidence that tends to prove the innocence of the accused, okay? When you withhold, there are very serious penalties for this. And citing a ruling by the court to dismiss with prejudice the Bundy case, Angle and O'Shaughnessy's attorneys are bringing up a request. Now listen to this request. A complete listing of all documents and other evidence destroyed and shredded by the United States and its agents, employees, and exculpatory evidence which has never been produced by the government, including the following items that came to light during the Tier 1 trial, which earned Judge Navarro's scathing rebuke of the United States as constituting flagrant prosecutorial misconduct, outrageous conduct amounting to a due process violation, and a reckless disregard for its constitutional obligations. And specifically, they cite surveillance camera evidence, FBI 302 investigative reports. Now, if you remember with Trump, this 302, you start getting into these things that are common themes throughout in the United States when we're dealing with the deep state. Tactical Operations Center log records and threat assessments. Now, we're going to get into each one of these here in a second. But the fact of the matter is that what they're arguing is that there wasn't just hiding of evidence. They're arguing that there was actual destruction of evidence that could have happened here.
Larry Wooten has named witnesses, and the special agent in charge made comments such as, this is what I think of them and their rules. And that's when he would throw it in the shredder. He had no concern for the damage that he was doing to the fabric of our country.
Now, I find it interesting that this is not just involving the Nevada case, it's also involving the Oregon case and another case, very famous, at least in Western law, in the Western United States, regarding the Hage family, that it came out now in this Wooten II memo that they were talking about, quote, jacking up Hage, end quote, Wayne Hage Jr., and then they talk about, with some very derogatory terms that we're not going to repeat here on Patriot Radio, all of these terms that they would frequently use toward people instead of being unbiased. And this is what Wooten says, quote, it became clear to me a serious public and professional image problem developed within the BLM Office of Law Enforcement and Security. I felt I needed to correct this and mitigate the damage it no doubt had already done, end quote. Now, this isn't the first we've heard about this. So, Sherry, if you could take a moment and kind of go through some of this clear bias that was from the very beginning.
Well, I think the Hage case was mentioned in the kill list, though I don't have those details. I don't have the page in front of me. I've got 250 pages here.
Right,
so forgive me if I don't get to the right page. But there was a very specific agenda And can I name the special agent in charge? Am I allowed to do that?
Well, I mean, I think that's a matter of record because it says in here, former
Well,
BLM
it's all
special
over my
agent in
website.
charge, Dan Love. I mean, it says it here on
That's
page
right.
65. Yeah.
It's all over my website as well. I've got a lot of information on him. And he had a specific agenda. He did religious tests. He didn't like Mormons. And if you were Mormon, he was going to make a big deal about it to make people treat you in a derogatory manner. There was a whole long list. He had, almost a checklist, and he made the claims apparently that he owned the director, so nothing could happen to him. He could do anything he wanted to because he knew where the bodies were buried, basically. And that seems to have been true because nothing has happened to him. He has committed crimes, or I guess I should quantify that with he has appeared to commit crimes in my layman's eyes.
Well, and that's also what Larry Wooten is saying, is at the very least, there could be possible, and I think in one other place he says likely criminal behavior that needs to be investigated. So regardless, I mean, at the very minimum, there should be an investigation of these allegations. And I just want to quote one more thing here. It said, and this is in regards to Special Agent in Charge, Dan Love. It says, recommendations in order to command the most intrusive, oppressive, large-scale, and militaristic trespass cattle impound possible. Additionally, this investigation also indicated excessive use of force, civil rights, and policy violations. The investigation indicated that there was little doubt that there was an improper cover-up in virtually every matter that a particular BLM SAC participated in, this is talking again about Dan Love, or oversaw, and that the BLM SAC was immune from discipline and consequences of his actions. Just like you were saying, it's just right here, right in the middle of this whistleblower memorandum.
This will affect dozens of defendants. This will affect people that were forced into making a plea deal. The clock is going to restart for them because this is so much information that they were not allowed to have. And it will help the defendants in the Nevada trials. It will also help the defendants in the Oregon trials because they are also named in here. Anybody who spent, a considerable amount of time in jail, it is my understanding that they're going to have a case. This is tremendous. They're going to, have lawsuits coming out the years. They had Eric Parker, is quite willing to tell his story. He was charged with a whole laundry list of charges. Pete Santilli, who first posted Wooten II, he was forced into making a plea deal. You've got, I can't even remember everybody's name. You've got people, Jerry DeLemus, who spent 7 years in prison over this, and he wasn't even there. He wasn't even at the event. He didn't get there until days afterwards. Everybody, and it was all the corrupt FBI and BLM's agenda. They were insistent. They were told not to do something. They said, too bad, we're going to do it anyway because you can't touch us. That is not how our government is supposed to run. And that is why everybody gathered in the wash down in southern Nevada and defended each other.
This is also interesting, too, that there was an admission, page 69. Defense counsel also decided not to return the iPad back to Dave Bundy, even though the iPad wasn't going to be searched pursuant to a search warrant or used as evidence in trial. So there's another little part of that. The reason why is given a little bit later, again, in this Larry Wooten memo on page 125. It says that they inadvertently captured audio of officers bragging about roughing up Dave Bundy and grinding his face into the pavement and talking about how Dave Bundy had little bits of gravel stuck in his face. And then later it talks about that they didn't even really have the authority to begin with to arrest him because he was constitutionally protected in his speech where he was standing. He was just filming on the side of the road. What's your reaction to that?
I want to go up and smack somebody, but I'm not allowed to do that. I feel so bad for Dave Bundy. He didn't do anything wrong, and he was physically abused and arrested, and then just told to walk away later. And I don't believe he's ever received his iPad back, of which he said he needed it to run his business. And again, all they wanted was to cover up their wrongdoing. That's what the bottom line was. The corrupt FBI and BLM wanted to cover up their own wrongdoing.
Right, and the reason that we're winning is because we haven't smacked anybody upside the head, right? They want to. And that's why ultimately truth comes out like this. You can't hide the truth forever. And we've seen this stuff. We've talked about it, and we had a whole bunch of people try and label us domestic terrorists for pursuing justice for these folks. And we're going to get into that right now. So one of the documents, curiously, that is included in this whistleblower memorandum is it mentions the House Democratic Forum on Countering Extremism on America's Public Lands. And this is originally, so this is back in June 15th, 2016. So this is page 106. And what it says is, members and witnesses characterized extremist views pertaining to federal land management as a form of domestic terrorism. So this is where the domestic terrorism narrative really began in earnest, and where they basically said that everybody should be coming against domestic terrorists, and anybody associated with this would be labeled a domestic terrorist. This is what brought on the House investigation against me in the legislature before I retired. They intentionally wanted to label me because of us exposing the corruption that was happening inside the BLM, and more importantly, inside the BLM, which operates in Washington State, in Idaho, in Utah, in Nevada. So it's not just one state. This was many states that were involved. So let's talk a little bit about this domestic terrorism narrative. With Wooten II showing this level of corruption, that this was intentional by the government to not only withhold evidence, but to do this militaristic approach to the Bundys, that they were actually, and I would use the word terrorizing the Bundy family, because they were, as was shown and now is being argued, acting outside the law. If that is been talked about by the court, now ruled on by the court, we know that this has happened, then that completely shatters the domestic terrorism narrative, doesn't it? I mean, how does this go from here? Because they have no leg anymore to stand on.
As domestic terrorism themselves, they could not say the same thing about everybody else. They could, it was like it's like I'm sure everybody will understand this. The Democrats project, and that's exactly what was happening here. The BLM and FBI were projecting their behavior onto what I call their victim. And I'm looking for a particular page, and what it is the special agent in charge said that they needed, to really wake everybody up, they needed an officer-involved shooting to happen. And they had that. They had that with LaVoy. And that just takes it another step, but it's all the same thing. It's all the domestic terrorism, extremism of the government, not of the people.
So let's read that. Let's quote that right now. Page 189, quote, the office narrative that evolved was that there needs to be an officer-involved shooting to make these types of people get the message. What types of people? The types of people that would vote for Donald Trump, the types of people that own farms and ranches. That's exactly what they're talking about. In fact, it goes on to say that specifically Mormons were called out in this and made fun of by, and it says again, BLM ASAC, so this is the BLM Assistant Special Agent in charge, told me that there was a, quote, little Mormon girl that fell down and got muddy and had to go the rest of the day dirty and muddy, and that she wasn't able to use her essential oils. And again, this is just one, and I'm not, the names aren't, as important as the idea that it was this officer's observation that the office narrative had evolved to the point where they weren't prosecuting violators. They were trying to invent them. And they were trying to send a message to conservatives, ranchers, farmers in the Western United States. If you stand up against us, you could die. That's what he is saying right here in this memorandum. This is one of the most powerful parts of this entire thing. Sherry, please continue.
Well, that one affected me tremendously because I love Lavoie. He was a good man. But it showed, and Larry Wooten, he names people as witnesses. This is not something he's just decided, it must be this way. It sounds like it's this way. It could be this way. No, he's got witness saying this is how it is. And he's got multiple witnesses. The entire narrative within their department, their office, their region even, that went all the way up to their directors, I believe, had this same animosity towards anybody conservative, anybody who didn't, fall within their agenda. And they talk about Butch Otter, the former governor of Idaho, and whether or not he's going to, get on board with their sage grouse agenda. They talk about a lot of people. They have no shame in their nastiness. And it's pure nastiness. They don't say anything nice, and they make sure that everybody takes part in it. If you don't take part in it, they boot you out of there and, start hassling you. Larry Wooten is now under whistleblower status because of this. And he was harassed terribly. He explains it all in here, the harassment he and his family received because he just wanted to do the right thing.
So was I. I was harassed horrendously as well for just bringing forward with you that whistleblower memorandum, which, again, under federal law, retaliation against whistleblowers is illegal. And yet that's exactly what was happening. And so I'm glad to hear that there are some congressional investigations, it sounds like, potentially in the offing. This is something that has to be discussed. But more importantly, we can't have strongly worded letters anymore. We need to have action that holds these people accountable, puts them on trial, not just fire them, put them on trial and give them their day in court. But if they're convicted, they need to pay a price for operating outside the law under the color of law.
It is my understanding that Thomas Massey and Mike Lee each have copies of Wooten II. They have asked for some time to go through it with a fine-tooth comb and to share it with a few other congressmen. We will see where it comes from that. I hope they stand up and do the right thing.
Now, I'm going to talk. Yeah, please keep going. I want to talk about the next three big issues while we still have a little bit of time.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
All right. So there are a couple things. So we were talking about way back then that the heavy-handedness of the federal government in dealing with this, and that, there were arguably, even back then, people had identified, hey, there was no notice given here, all of these things, that there were some serious legal problems with the way that the federal government approaches. We had no idea about Wooten, no idea about what had gone on behind the scenes. But one of the biggest things was this issue of snipers on site. And I want to read page 119, where it says, the individuals are typically referred generically as snipers. But remember, in a law enforcement setting, these individuals should be utilized defensively and or at a last resort. The issue is that the U.S. Attorney's Office and seemingly official talking points were deceptive. Now, it gets even more interesting because in that same motion that I read from earlier, it specifically calls out that in court, federal agents lied by saying that there were no snipers there, and yet there was evidence, is what they're arguing, that there was evidence that they were carrying long rifles and that these people had been sniper school trained. Now, more interestingly, if we want to put this one up, we have a sniper range card. Quite literally had maps of these positions where these people were. So, Sherry, go ahead and let's add some context here.
Well, we were told right, from the get-go and constantly that there were no snipers, but we actually posted pictures of the snipers on our website. And it turns out there wasn't one team of snipers. There were 3 teams of snipers pointed at the Bundy house. And that just makes it, that much more, because Steve Irie in court said it was a figment of our imagination, basically. And he knew that there were snipers, and he told the court that there were not. That is the prosecutor, the U.S. attorney, or deputy U.S. attorney. How does that work?
So this is an interesting thing, too, on page 111 and page 112, where it says that this appears to be Larry Wooten here in this part of the memorandum. So they redacted some of the names. I also followed up on Clive and Bundy's accusations that there were laser aiming dots pointed at Bundy and his family. Members of the Special Events Tactical Team were equipped with eye-visible aiming lasers. There were also numerous other concerning instances of misrepresented government talking points. And this issue of the laser aiming dots being pointed at people, again, in the context of, was this even a legal operation? I mean, this then becomes outrageous at that point.
Absolutely. They had no legal basis. They had no warrant. They had no legal document authorizing them to do what they did. Nobody has been able to produce one. They keep saying that there is one, but they could not produce it. They had never shown it to a grand jury. They've never shown it to a judge. It is my understanding that, they pulled it out of their ear. They just made it up.
Well, this brings us to page 120, which is probably one of the most important pages of this entire series of documents. On page 120, it talks about how, while there were no photographs allowed, and this is in regards to the arrest tracking board, that the arrest tracking wall had a photograph of the defendants with X's through them. And then it goes on to state that, you need to listen to this, the threat assessments didn't support the vast, aggressive, militaristic trespass cattle compound operation and the tactical disposition, number and equipment of the officers and agents. The threat assessments did just the opposite. They supported the Nevada state recommendation of a soft impound and or associated property lien, which we talked about back then, by the way, as described and recommended by the Nevada Animal Industry Administrator, Brand Inspector Flint Wright. Now, here's why this is important. The Rampart report withheld exculpatory evidence. So at the very beginning of the report, and in fact, let's shift there really quick, if we could, Sawyer. On page 6, it says, this report sets forth the essential determination of facts and represents a fair and objective comprehensive analysis. Moreover, the extensive contemporaneous documentation of information provided important insights into Representative Shea. No party attempt to influence the analysis and findings in this report, and yet they withheld one of the more dramatic exculpatory pieces of evidence here, this threat assessment, which apparently they had access to. Now, this is what's also very interesting. In addition to that, even if they didn't have access to it, my attorneys actually offered the evidence, and they refused to allow us to bring the evidence in, very similarly to how they did in federal court. So you see kind of this pattern of behavior developing. So that's just the first part of this page. We're going to get to the next part. Sherry, what is your thoughts on that? Because this was an intentional mischaracterization.
They did that throughout every trial. I sat through every trial in Nevada and Oregon, and that was rampant. And, it was crazy. You would have a solid piece of evidence in your hand, and the judge would say, "No, we only want stuff that'll go against the defendants." Okay, it's the same thing that happened to you. I'm just glad their name wasn't Clinton. You never know what might have happened then.
Well, I'm going to break for the very first time. I've held this. They refuse to accept this into evidence as part of this so-called investigation, the Champart report. They refuse to accept this into evidence, and here's why. Because it went against the narrative. Just like we just talked about with this threat assessment, it went against this prevailing narrative. And, I think it's important for all of us to understand that when you have a report like this, say, simply put, I believe the threat assessments were purposely not disclosed because they went against the narrative. That's what it says here on page 120. That also carries over into other places. And I'm going to give you an example here. I sent an email on January 1st, 2016. Now, again, they had access to this and refused to put it in the report. So you can't claim that it was non-biased when you don't put in something this explosive. I sent out on January 1st, 2016, the following. It said, we will not be going, this network will not be going down to Oregon. And then I state the reasons why. And I also mention that we have to approach this from a Christian perspective. This is literally what I put in here. However, when we step outside this approach, we lack legitimate authority, legitimate covering, and set ourselves and the entire movement of Christian patriots up for failure. I didn't use the word Christian patriots, but that's what I'm referring to. And here's what I said. We instead need to, instead of going to Oregon, we need to establish prayer covering, research the facts on the ground, verify and confirm, get commitment from people directly affected by the federal government's unlawful actions. Notice we mentioned it back then, and we were right. Wow. Then it continues. Build a local coalition of elected officials, peace officers, legal experts, and grassroots leaders. Create a strategy and plan of execution and well-established goals and objectives that will support the vision of restoring a God-honoring constitutional republic and the mission of resisting tyranny and reclaiming ground for liberty at the state and local level. We should all believe that. At least thought so. And then it goes on with a couple other detailed things. But my point is, they had this access to this email, and they refused to put it into the Champart report. And this goes right in line with a fake threat assessment, because in the report, it tries to paint this picture of everybody's searching for violence. And of course, they always remove the documents that prove otherwise, because it's not unbiased. It is biased according to an agenda to try to smear those who actually love this country. Sherry, go ahead and react to that.
My reaction is that I've done several articles on Brady violations and Giglio, et cetera, but I would like to ask a question. Has any U.S. attorney or deputy U.S. attorney ever been held accountable for the egregious violations like this? Because not just the stuff that happened to you, but this is happening all over the country. People are, the prosecutors are getting away with terrorizing good conservative Christian patriots, and they're not being held accountable. What can be done about that?
Well, and this also kind of plays into the fifth generation warfare issue that Mike Flynn has been bringing up. Just a little bit farther down on page 120, it says, you may also remember disclosures about an extensive social media BLM misinformation campaign directed by, and then again, this is redacted, It seemed to have the effect of aggravating the public sentiment. The misinformation campaign was similar to a military operation and intelligence gathering operation, and was in regard to constitutionally protected First Amendment activities and akin to the intelligence preparation of the battlefield. So again, what they try to project onto us, they were the ones that were actually doing a misinformation. You think about that. The taxpayers' money was going toward deceiving the public. What say you, Sherry?
They said, or at least Dan Love would say that every time he went and bought something special, he'd say, "Thank you, Clive and Bundy, for buying this for me," because everything he was doing was being funded by this agenda of his.
Now,
and that was the general at their office. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, you're right. It was the general sentiment at their office. And here's one more. I'll just have you react to this too. This activity, okay, so this is the activity, the so-called Threat Mitigation Unit. This activity was evidently prohibited by FBI policy. Okay, so this is talking about this using social media and undercover accounts and open monitoring, okay, on social media. This activity was prohibited by FBI policy, was allowed and conducted in the absence of a specific BLM policy. In essence, by using a directed loophole to conduct the electronic surveillance and monitoring. Now, here's the important part of this. Federal agencies aren't supposed to just, see what they can get away with and get around the Constitution. They're actually supposed to go the other way and be more protective as much as possible because they actually take an oath to protect and defend it. Go ahead, Sherry.
I have actually run into officers, federal officers and state level officers that would look at me and sneer at me and say, "Oh, you're one of those constitutionalists, aren't you?" And that was very telling, especially from the federal officers who are supposed to have taken an oath to the Constitution. They have, an absolute disdain for the Constitution, and they will do anything they can to thwart it.
Wow. Now, I'm going to get to the last. This is a little salacious, okay? So if you have younger listeners or viewers, you may want to remove them from the room. This is a little bit sexually charged. Page 202. Again, this is talking about the widespread culture of unprofessionalism inside the BLM. And it says this, that one of the officers stated that he was told to put down less hours than he actually worked in reference to the 2014 Gold Butte trespass cattle impound. This is the Bundy case, okay? Due to administrative requirements such as work rest guidelines. In other words, they were being advised to intentionally doctor payroll, okay? And then it continues. This is interesting. The officer said that the BLM SAC, so again, this is the BLM special agent in charge, got on the radio sounding impaired and stated that the AUSA, the assistant U.S. attorney, was in no condition to go anywhere. And the context of this was that another officer stated that while at the Burning Man event, he was part of a team that made an arrest and needed to speak with the AUSA, and the AUSA was requested over the radio. So this is the context. So the officer said that the BLM SAC got on the radio sounding impaired and stated the AUSA was in no condition to go anywhere. The officer further indicated the BLM SAC and the AUSA had been drinking. This officer also mentioned something about believing the BLM SAC and the AUSA had sex, and that was the reason that the BLM SAC and the AUSA wasn't available. Now, I want you to understand what I just said. He is alleging in this memorandum that an assistant U.S. attorney and a special agent in charge were, politely creating a massive conflict of interest. So in the last minute that we have left, Sherry, go ahead. What say you?
What say me?
Yeah.
I want to see some people in jail. It was more than a conflict of interest. It went way beyond a conflict of interest. Numerous cases, numerous defendants, people died over this. People died between being forced to commit suicide, being shot. People died, and they have yet to be held accountable. This department, this BLM and FBI, we have since then exposed massive corruption within them. This just reaffirms everything that we have talked about, and we need somebody to be held accountable for it. Why can't they be held accountable the way they insist that the people be held?
I completely agree. This demands a congressional investigation. The law enforcement that intentionally went along with this in collusion, it appears, with the media. I mean, this sets up potential defamation cases. This is a bombshell. It really is. And the law enforcement that went along with defending the federal government's corruption, that also needs to be held accountable, whether we're talking in Nevada or Spokane, Washington. And I hope and I pray that justice here is done for America, for people like Todd Engel, Joseph O'Shaughnessy. It is done. But this isn't the last episode on this. We only got about halfway through. There is so much more. Sherry Duvally, thank you for joining me on Patriot Radio today. Readout News is fantastic. Readoutnews.com and readoutreport.com. I want everybody tonight take a moment and a breath and ask the Lord how you need to be standing up to defend this great country. This is Matt Shea. Thank you for joining me on Patriot Radio today. May God bless all of you. He is making this generation the greatest one. The awakening is here. Keep up the fight.